Is new evidence regarding the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, which was recently presented in a documentary on Channel 5 in the UK, really the smoking gun in the case that one of the presenters calls it? This is my review of the show and what they had to say. Before I start, I just want to say that due to the speed I'm having to turn this bonus episode around in, I'm not going to have time to do as many visuals in the video as I usually would. So if you're new here, just be aware they're usually a bit slicker than this. I mean, there are going to be points here where the same image is on screen for a couple of minutes at a time, which is not normal for me. The documentary aired on Tuesday night. I'm recording this on Wednesday afternoon, and it's being published less than 72 hours after the show's airing because I already have a video that I want to put out in my regular Monday slot. To speed things up, I've also lifted some sections out of the scripts for the previous 3 videos I have on the princes, all linked below. One looking at the whole case from start to finish, another at whether bones supposed to be theirs could be DNA tested, and a third reviewing an entirely different documentary about what may have happened to them. If you've watched those other videos, you're therefore going to recognise some of what you hear here, but I don't have time to sit and rewrite certain paragraphs just for the sake of it. Lastly, I hope I don't make any errors here, but again, given the speed at which I'm pumping this out, it's definitely a possibility. If I come across any later, I'll put the necessary corrections in the pinned comment under the video. If you find this content valuable, please give the video a thumbs up and leave a comment below, it really helps me out, and subscribe if you haven't already with the notification bell switched on. This new documentary is 90 minutes long, including ads, and is presented by historian Tracy Borman and actor Jason Watkins, with input from other academics along the way. The majority of it repeats what we already know about the disappearance of the so-called princes in the Tower, so I'm just going to briefly tell you the story for those of you who are new to it or who need a refresher. In April 1483, King Edward IV of England died, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son Edward V, then at Ludlow Castle in the care of his maternal uncle Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, and his maternal half-brother Richard Grey. When the new king's paternal uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who was to be the boy's protector, found out what had happened though, he intercepted the new king and his entourage on the 29th of April while they were on their way to London. He seized control of the boy the next day and had Rivers and Grey arrested, sent north, and soon executed on the 25th of June on apparently trumped-up charges of planning to kill him, Gloucester. He took the king to the capital, where he installed little Edward in the Tower of London, ostensibly to prepare for his coronation, scheduled for the 22nd of June. Meanwhile, the Dowager Queen, Elizabeth Woodville, with whom Gloucester did not get along, took her remaining children and fled into sanctuary in Westminster Abbey on the 1st of May. She had with her her youngest royal son, Richard, Duke of York, also known as Richard of Shrewsbury, then aged 9. On the 13th of June, Gloucester had the 2 boys' staunch supporter, Lord Hastings, executed without trial, and 3 days later, Elizabeth, willingly or unwillingly, surrendered the Duke of York to his uncle's custody, and the child was sent to the Tower to join his brother. There would be no coronation of Edward V, however. Instead, Gloucester had all his brother Edward's children by Elizabeth declared illegitimate, on the basis of the dead king's supposed bigamy. I have a video on that topic if you want to see it, it's linked on screen and below. And he took the throne on the 26th of June. He was crowned on the 6th of July, and in a coronation roll referring to this ceremony, there exists a list of clothing items ordered for Lord Edward, son of late King Edward IV. This would appear to be a reference to Edward V after he had been deposed, but though the documentary mentions evidence that the child was still alive at this point, it doesn't clarify that it means this role, so I'm just making a guess here, and there is no evidence that either boy attended the coronation. According to a later chronicle, written between 1504 and 1512 by a man named Robert Fabian, the new Richard III's nephews were at first seen playing in the grounds of the Tower and practising archery. But according to a report by an Italian scholar named Dominic Mancini, who was in London in the summer of 1483, soon their servants were dismissed and they were, quote, withdrawn into the inner apartments of the Tower proper, and day by day began to be seen more rarely behind the bars and windows, till at length they ceased to appear altogether. The physician John Argentine, the last of his attendants whose services the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. They were never seen again, and Richard never offered any explanation as to what had happened to them. By the autumn of 1483, it was widely assumed that they were dead. Richard then died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, when he was defeated by the new king, Henry Tudor. The most popular theory then and now is that Richard had his nephews killed in order to secure his hold on the throne, though plenty of people dispute that. In 1674, bones were found in a chest buried beneath a staircase in the White Tower, the central building in the Tower complex, and they were believed to be those of the two lost children, though in fact these are just one set of bones found over the centuries in the Tower which have been connected to the princes. See my video on whether they can be DNA tested to hear about the others. They were interred under those names in an urn in Westminster Abbey, and a 1933 examination of them, which is the most recent examination there has been, claimed that they were the correct size for two boys who were Edward and York's ages. The documentary goes through pretty much all of this information, though it omits Richard's killing of Rivers and Grey, often doesn't specify which sources it's using or offer any analysis of their advantages and disadvantages, and adds in some padding about Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard, Edward V's life at Ludlow, the death of Henry VI in the Tower back in 1471, and the discovery of Richard III's bones in 2012 under a car park and their subsequent examination. There were also a few other omissions and statements which I thought were a bit misleading, though they weren't too serious. We don't know for sure that Edward IV died on the 9th of April, for instance, and the documentary doesn't really give it a lot of detail about how the boys and their sisters were declared illegitimate. For a fuller account of that episode, see my video on the case. When discussing the discovery of the bones in 1674, the documentary also glossed over how they were treated, omitting the fact that the workmen who came across them initially chucked them on a rubbish heap, and making rather a lot of the fact that one report says there were scraps of velvet with them. It doesn't explain what this report was, but it comes from a book written by Richard Davey in 1910 in which he attributed this information to a manuscript in his personal possession, which is now long gone, if it ever existed, and can't be checked for either its content or provenance. Davey is known to have made things up, especially in his work on Lady Jane Grey actually, and got things wrong sometimes too, so I'd be sceptical of what he claims was written in this fantastic document that has never been seen by anyone else. He also said the bones were of boys in their teens, which was incorrect. Still, the inscription on the urn in which they were interred, which might even be the inspiration for Davy's later claims, says they were, quote, found by most certain tokens. So maybe there was something with the bones to suggest their identity. We don't know that it was velvet though, so when the documentary made the point that Edward V owned velvet clothing, I just thought this was unnecessary because A, it's hardly surprising that the heir to the throne was bought velvet clothes, and B, we don't actually know that the story the bones were found with velvet is true. That's a pretty minor critique though, I just thought it could have been left on the editing room floor to make way for some of the other information I've mentioned that seems more relevant. Moving on, what I did appreciate was the little discussion of how well guarded the children would have been and how ludicrous it is to suggest that they could have escaped from the tower, as this theory is at the root of many stories that one or both of them somehow made it out and got to mainland Europe. Though the documentary didn't specify this, that point about the impenetrability of the tower also makes it extremely unlikely that anyone was able to break in and harm them, and makes a mockery of those who claim that Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, had her minions kill them, and that Richard just never mentioned it and allowed himself to be blamed across the continent for the fate of the children. I also really like the documentary's discussion of the bones now in the urn in Westminster Abbey. The bones themselves can't be re-examined without royal permission, but they had a modern doctor look at the report about them from the 1930s, which gave their measurements. This information could be used to confirm that they are concurrent with two children of the correct ages, and having worked out the younger child's height and compared it to the average heights of 10-year-old boys in the 15th century, the doctor was able to point out that this child was quite a bit taller, suggesting a healthy, high-status diet and possibly a genetic link to the very tall Edward IV. None of this was conclusive, but if we're never going to be allowed to look at the bones again, whatever's left of them, it might be the best we can get. There are many theories as to what happened to the boys, and I go through them in my video on the case, but the one the documentary focuses on is recounted by Thomas More, future favourite minister of Henry VIII, in his unfinished History of King Richard III, which was written during the 1510s, though unpublished until 1557 after his death. More claimed that whilst at Gloucester on his post-coronation tour, Richard decided to rid himself of his nephews to better secure his grip on the throne. He sent a man named John Green to the Tower with a letter for its constable, Sir Robert Brackenbury, telling him to put the boys to death, but Brackenbury refused. The documentary omits this information, in fact it omits all mention of Brackenbury's role, and instead skips ahead to when Richard supposedly sent his servant, Sir James Tyrell, I've also heard that pronounced Tyrell, but I'll go with Tyrell because that's what the documentary does, to do the job instead, dispatching him to the Tower with another letter for Brackenbury, instructing him to turn over to Tyrell all the keys to the building. Once he had these keys, Tyrell decided to kill the boys the next night in their beds. He delegated the task, though, to two men named Miles Forrest and John Dighton, who was Tyrrell's horsekeeper, and at midnight they stole into the boys' room and smothered them in their bed linens, pillows, and feather beds. Once they were dead, their killers stripped them and brought in Tyrrell to view the bodies. What More goes on to say, though the documentary doesn't include this information, is that he, quote, caused those murderers to bury them at the stair foot, meetly deep in the ground under a great heap of stones. This would appear to tally with the discovery of the bones under a staircase in 1674. However, More then adds that though King Richard was delighted with the news, he ordered that the boys should be buried somewhere better on account of their royal blood. They were therefore disinterred, and Brackenbury had a priest secretly bury them in another place, the location of which was lost after the priest's death. Now, I appreciated the fact that the documentary does note some issues with More, the fact that he wasn't there and was writing so much later being two big ones. But the presenters say that he was a trustworthy guy who would later die on the scaffold for his principles, didn't publish this work during his lifetime, and so wasn't a propagandist. He must have believed what he wrote, they claim. This last bit is backed up by a More quote, which isn't in the doc, but I'm going to share it, in which he says that although he'd heard other stories of what happened to the princes, when it comes to this version, I have so heard by such men and by such means, as methinketh it were hard, but it should be true. You can certainly argue for More's credibility, but just to play devil's advocate, I think that you could also argue that there's no evidence he would refuse to push later Tudor propaganda, that his work is filled with known errors, that he just never got around to getting it published, or that he didn't publish it because he didn't want to accuse people of such a crime when he wasn't sure. He also wrote his book like an historical novel much of the time, putting words and thoughts into the mouths of its characters, for lack of a better word, that there's no way he could have known about. In other words, he took artistic license. It's not a scholarly history book of the type we have today. I don't like either that the documentary failed to mention the detail of the story about the bodies not being in the location which More stated they were put in. That feels a little bit like cherry-picking the evidence to me, and I think you have to look at More's account as a whole and not just at the bits that you want to be true. Next, they ask if there is any other evidence that Tyrrell was guilty. This brings us to the end of his life, when he was imprisoned in the Tower of London for treason in 1502, and where he supposedly confessed to arranging the killings before being executed on the 6th of May that year. More talks about this confession, and Dighton's, saying that they confessed the murder in manner above written, insinuating but not stating outright that these confessions were his source, though there's no way he was there to hear them, and he doesn't explain how he came by the details. Instead, he says only that his information had come from them that knew much and little cause had to lie. This might be the murderers themselves via the aforementioned confessions, or, as we'll see in a minute, it could be someone else. Sticking with the Tyrrell and Dighton confessions, though the documentary doesn't mention the latter, perhaps because there's no direct evidence that Dighton even existed, much less that he was in the Tower of London and confessed, Borman cites evidence that Henry VII and his queen Elizabeth of York, sister of the Princess in the Tower, were staying at the Tower too at the same time, and wonders if they were there to hear what Tyrrell had to say. The fact that Queen Elizabeth then went to visit her aunt is odd, she says, almost as though Elizabeth wanted to share what she'd learned with one of her close female relations. Borman is clear that none of this is conclusive, but says the presence of the King and Queen in the Tower at the time is highly coincidental, and I think that's a fair assessment. It's not as though they never went there. Elizabeth died in the Tower after childbirth the following year, but they do seem to have been there at the same time as Tyrrell, so perhaps there was some connection, and obviously they both had a vested interest in learning what had happened to the boys. Borman and Watkins then get into the other new information they have learnt about this story. They talk to historian Professor Tim Thornton, who produces a document showing that Moore knew a courier called M. Forrest in the mid-1510s while he was in Bruges and writing up his book on Richard III. This M. Forrest would have been the son of the Miles Forrest who killed the boys. The importance of this is that this is where he could have heard the story of the boys' murder, and I think that's a decent hypothesis. We can't prove it, but this man would also fit Moore's description of his source as someone who knew much and little cause had to lie, and he may not have named him in the interests of keeping his source private. What the documentary doesn't mention, though, is that Miles Forrest Sr. was dead by September 1484, so anything his son knew would have had to have been told to him 30 years earlier if it was coming directly from the father, and as Miles Jr. didn't die until 1558, he must have been a very young child when his father passed, and so we're either relying on childhood memories here or on third-hand family lore, which weakens the case. To counteract this problem a little bit, I'm surprised the documentary didn't mention the fact that Moore knew Miles Jr. and his brother Edward in England during the 1510s and later, something which Professor Thornton has discussed in a very interesting 2020 article, which is freely available to read and for which I've left a link below. Moving on. The next bit of information is potentially even more interesting than the Forrest connection. There is a will written by a Margaret Capel who died in 1522 and who was the sister-in-law of James Tyrell. In it, she left a chain to her son that had apparently belonged to Edward V, then later come into her deceased husband's hands. This is what Tracy Borman called the smoking gun, this apparent link between a possession of Edward V's and James Tyrrell's family. The presenters and Thornton also immediately call it a chain of office, though I didn't see it called that in the will, but maybe there was more information that was just edited out that confirmed that it was this very special type of item, so I'm prepared to go with that analysis. So what did I make of all this? Well, I think it's definitely very interesting, and I'm glad the information is out there now to add to what we know about the case, but I don't think it's quite a smoking gun. We have no way of knowing if the younger Miles Forrest or his brother spoke to Moore about the case, though, as I said earlier, I think it's a solid hypothesis. But if they did, it means that we have to believe that one or both of them implicated their own father in a double child murder and regicide. Not impossible, but what would they have to gain from that? Anyways, we're never going to know, short of a miraculous new evidence find. The documentary also skips out some crucial information about Forrest Sr.'s fate and that of Dighton, which I'm going to share here. Moore specifically says that at the time of his writing, Forrest was already dead, as we know he died in 1484, but Dighton was still alive and free. Are we really to believe that, having confessed to such a crime, the man wasn't executed as Sir James Tyrell ultimately was, though even he wasn't killed for having assisted in the killing of the princes, and we need to bear in mind that there is no original source for the supposed confessions. To me, Dighton's apparent fate seems to be a massive plot hole in the story, as is the fact that if the three men involved in the killings at Richard III's behest were known about, and one or two had actually confessed, it's bizarre that Henry VII didn't make the whole story very public. I don't like that plot holes like this and the others I've already mentioned aren't addressed by the documentary. It also fails to acknowledge that Moore wasn't the first person to mention Sir James Tyrell. Remember that chronicle written by Robert Fabian between 1504 and 1512? Well, he mentioned Tyrell as being one of the suspects, as did Polydore Virgil writing in 1512-13, though he said Tyrell did it with his own hands. He also mentioned Sir Robert Brackenbury, just like Moore did. As for the suffocation, burial, exhumation and reburial, those reports were discussed by the Burgundian chronicler Jean Molyneux no later than 1506, though he said that the boys were reinterred during Henry VII's reign. So many of the details given by Moore were in circulation, even if only in manuscript form, years before he wrote them down, but none cited a Tower confession as their source. Again, if you see my video all about the case, I go into these reports in detail there. The producers of this documentary will certainly have known this because Professor Thornton wrote about it in the same 2020 article I already mentioned, in which he postulated that Moore may very well have read and been influenced by Fabian and Virgil's work. That potential explanation for where he got his information is not mentioned here though. In that article, Thornton did also say that perhaps Moore had had access to people who were adults at the time of the boys' disappearance and or to their children, and in fact he even established some links between Moore and Miles and Edward Forrest at that stage, that's Miles Jr. So this new document in which an M. Forrest is mentioned as a courier to Moore doesn't really give us anything we didn't already have, though it confirms the link between the pair at a slightly earlier date and is still interesting and a good find, so well done to Professor Thornton and any research assistants he may have had. I imagine that research was a lot of hard work in the archives, getting a sore neck poring over documents. He's also written another article looking at Henry VII's movements during his reign and published in 2024. Again, it's freely available and linked below and well worth a read. Finally, I'm cautious about the chain mentioned in Margaret's will because we don't know that it really was that of Edward V, and even if it was, we have no way of knowing how she got it, though certainly the link to Sir James Tyrell is interesting and a possible explanation. Otherwise, it is indeed quite the coincidence. After I'd finished this video and actually put it up as a premiere on YouTube, an early commenter also pointed out an extremely interesting piece of information that I didn't know. Again, this is one of the downsides to putting videos together this fast, which is that the information about the Edward V chain is not new. It was published in Susan James's book, Women's Voices in Tudor Wills, 1485 to 1603, which you're seeing a snippet of here, and which came out in 2015. I've left details of it in the description box. So this information wasn't the bombshell new find that I think it was made out to be in this documentary, and if it's a smoking gun, it's been smoking for quite a while, and Susan James probably deserved a mention if she's the first person who actually discovered this information. Thank you so much to the commenter, Rhiannon, for bringing it to my attention when there was still time for me to add this in, and apologies to my patrons as I've added this little extra bit into the video on the day it's being released on YouTube, so it wasn't in the version they got the day before, but it was such a good point I wanted to share it. So to sum up, I think this documentary presented some good, valuable information, particularly the new analysis of the bones, the info regarding Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's presence in the Tower of London at the time of Tyrrell's presence there, the link between Moore and the younger Forrest, and the chain in Margaret's will. Does it blow the case wide open? No, I don't think so, but it does lend credible support to a pre-existing theory, and that's no bad thing. I would have liked to see the Moore story more thoroughly interrogated and the issues with it that I've discussed here acknowledged, but this documentary is still worth a watch if you have the chance to see it. Just don't take it as a thorough examination of the case or of Moore's story about what happened to the boys, which by the by I think is still one of the most compelling explanations we have for their fate, even if it might not be true. This documentary isn't as sensational as the ads for it made out, or as the other documentary I reviewed about the princes in the tower was, but actually I think it's underpinned by better evidence than the other one, and I certainly don't regret watching it. Before I leave you, I wanted to let you know that my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, is now available for pre-order from Amazon as an ebook. There's a link in the description box below, and will shortly be released as both an ebook and a paperback. It's a directory of hundreds of websites which provide certificates, transcripts, photographs and other information that can help you build out your Irish family tree, learn your family stories so that your ancestors feel like three-dimensional people and feel better connected to your past. The websites are graded on a simple star system to tell you which ones are the best, and the book will also share with you which ones are free, and many are, plus provide tips on how best to use them. So whether you're a seasoned genealogist or you just want a new hobby, if you have Irish ancestry, I urge you to check this out. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that bonus video and didn't mind the slightly more basic visuals. Let me know below if any of this changes your opinion about what happened to the princes, and to learn more about the case or about that other documentary I reviewed on it which went in a totally different direction and claimed that at least one of the boys had survived, try one of these videos next. I'll be back on Monday for my regularly scheduled content, and until then, keep learning.